A single image holds eternity. A warrior king stands at the edge of the world, waves crashing against black cliffs below, storm clouds churning overhead like the breath of angry gods. His silhouette is carved against the dying light, sword raised, cape billowing in the merciless wind, eyes fixed on a horizon that holds both doom and destiny. They say the sea remembers everything, every drop of blood spilled upon its surface, every oath sworn and broken, every king who dared to believe he could conquer it. This is the story of one such king. His name was Ragnar Stormbreaker, though that was not the name given to him at birth. No, that name was forged in fire and tempered in the frozen waters of the North Atlantic, earned through a lifetime of impossible victories and devastating losses. By the time his saga reached its terrible, beautiful conclusion, his name would be whispered in fear from the shores of England to the gates of Byzantium. Children would grow quiet when elders spoke it. Warriors would touch iron and pray they never faced him in battle. But that comes later. First, you must understand where legends are born. The smell of smoke and blood hung thick in the morning air. The village of Bjornstad burned behind him as young Ragnar stood among the ruins of his childhood, watching ash fall like gray snow. He was 17 winters old, tall for his age, with eyes the color of storm clouds and a jaw already hardened by loss. His father, Jarl Eric the Wise, lay dead in the longhouse, an axe buried in his spine. His mother had fought to the last breath, taking 3 raiders with her before a spear found her heart. The raiders had come at dawn, as cowards do, men of Jarl Magnus the Cruel, their dragon-proud ships appearing like phantoms through the coastal fog. They wanted land. They wanted gold. They wanted to remind Eric that old alliances meant nothing when power shifted like sand. They got all of that. What they didn't expect was the boy who survived. Ragnar stood in the ruins, sword in hand, his father's sword, still warm from the fire that had tried to consume it. The blade was called Ulfhidnar*, wolf skin, forged from ore said to have fallen from the stars themselves. The weight of it felt wrong in his young hands, too heavy with responsibility, with legacy, with the burden of vengeance yet to be claimed. The wind howled across the smoldering remains, carrying with it the salt sting of the nearby sea. Ragnar could hear it calling to him even then. The waves. The endless, hungry waves that had carried his ancestors to glory and damnation in equal measure. He made a vow that morning, there among the ash and bone of everything he'd ever loved. He would make the gods themselves remember his name. 10 years passed like the turning of seasons, swift and merciless. Ragnar Stormbreaker emerged from obscurity like a kraken from the depths, gathering to his banner every outcast, every wanderer, every warrior who had been cast aside by the old order. He found allies in unlikely places. Astrid Ironside's ***, a shield maiden who had been exiled for refusing to marry a jarl twice her age. She became his right hand, fierce as a wolverine and loyal to her marrow. Orm the Wanderer ***, a skald and strategist who had memorized every saga and could predict enemy movements as if reading them from the Norn's own tapestry. Bjorn Firebeard ***, a berserker who channeled his rage with the precision of a master craftsman, his axes singing songs of death in battle. Together they carved a legend from the raw material of violence and vision. They raided first the villages that had stood silent while Bjornstad burned, then the holdings of Jarl Magnus himself. The clash of steel rang out across frozen fjords, shields splintering, men screaming, the copper taste of blood sharp on winter air. Ragnar fought like a man possessed by Odin's own fury, Ulfhidnar weaving patterns of death that left even hardened warriors backing away in fear. Magnus fell on the 3rd raid, his head taken by Ragnar's blade while the old Jarl begged for mercy he had never shown others. Ragnar gave him the same mercy his father received, none. News of the young king spread like wildfire through the north. Jarls and chieftains came to swear fealty or test their steel against his. Most chose wisely. Those who didn't were buried in unmarked graves, their names forgotten, their lands absorbed into Ragnar's growing kingdom. By his 30th winter, Ragnar Stormbreaker ruled the largest territory the North had seen in 3 generations. His longships numbered in the hundreds, their dragon figureheads striking terror from Scotland to the Mediterranean. His warriors were the best trained, best equipped fighting force in the known world. His reputation had grown so vast that Christian kings sent tribute rather than face his wrath. And yet he was not satisfied. Because Ragnar had learned a terrible truth that all conquerors eventually face. The higher you climb, the further you have to fall. And there were those in his own circle who hungered for that fall with the patience of wolves watching a wounded deer. The thunder crashed overhead as the war council gathered in Ragnar's great hall at Stormheim. The Longhouse was a monument to victory, its walls lined with shields taken from defeated enemies, its rafters hung with banners from a dozen conquered lands. The fire pit in the center roared and crackled, casting dancing shadows that made the room feel alive, breathing, watching. The smell of roasting meat mixed with mead and wood smoke, the sounds of warriors drinking and boasting providing a backdrop to the deadly serious conversation taking place at the high table. Ragnar sat in his carved chair, Ulfhidnar resting across his knees, eyes surveying his inner circle with the wariness of a man who had learned that trust was a luxury kings could rarely afford. To his right, Astrid, her scarred hands wrapped around a drinking horn, her gray eyes missing nothing. She had been with him since the beginning, saved his life more times than either could count. If he had a conscience, it wore her face. To his left, Orm, quill and parchment before him, his thin fingers constantly moving as he took notes, calculated, planned. The old Skald had turned Ragnar's brutal efficiency into something resembling strategy, transformed random raids into coordinated campaigns that broke kingdoms. Across from him, Bjorn, his massive frame barely contained by the bench he sat upon, red beard braided with bones and amber. The berserker's eyes held that faraway look they always did between battles, as if he lived partially in Valhalla already. And at the far end, Halfdan the Serpent ***, Ragnar's cousin, who had joined their cause 5 winters past after his own father was killed in a blood feud. Halfdan was everything Ragnar was not, smooth-tongued where Ragnar was blunt, political where Ragnar was direct, ambitious in ways that went beyond glory and into pure, naked hunger for power. The rain hammered against the roof like the footsteps of giants. Outside, the storm raged as if the gods themselves were angry. Perhaps they were. The Christian kingdoms grow bold, Orm was saying, his voice cutting through the ambient noise like a blade through flesh. King Ethelred has fortified the eastern coast. The Franks are building new forts along the rivers. Even the fat bishops are learning to fight. Let them build, Bjorn growled, slamming his fist on the table hard enough to make cups jump. Walls mean nothing. We'll break them as we've broken everything else. Walls mean time, Astrid countered, her voice calm but firm. Time to gather forces, time to forge alliances, time to turn their fear into preparation. We've been winning for so long we've forgotten what it means to face a truly organized enemy. Ragnar listened, turning his drinking horn in his hands, the weight of leadership pressing down on his shoulders like armor that never came off. The fire popped and hissed, sending up sparks that died in the smoke-darkened rafters. We don't need to break walls, Halfdan said smoothly, leaning forward into the firelight. His handsome face was all sharp angles and calculated charm. We need to make them irrelevant. I've been speaking with traders, merchants, diplomats. The Byzantine emperor grows old and paranoid. His generals squabble like dogs over scraps. If we sail south, if we offer our swords to the highest bidder, we could become kingmakers. We could have gold beyond counting, lands beyond measure. without losing a single warrior to Christian walls. Silence fell across the table like a blade. Astrid's eyes narrowed. You speak of becoming mercenaries, we who have bent kings to our will. I speak of wisdom, Halfdan replied, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. Of choosing wealth over glory, of ensuring our children inherit kingdoms, not songs of dead heroes. Ragnar felt the tension coiling in the room like a serpent preparing to strike. Outside, the wind screamed against the walls, as if the world itself was howling in warning. Our ancestors sailed into the unknown not for gold, Ragnar said quietly, his voice cutting through the debate with the authority of absolute rule. They sailed because they refused to bow, because they looked at the horizon and saw not a limit but a challenge. Gold is heavy, cousin. It weighs down the soul. Glory is weightless. It carries us to Valhalla. Halfdan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he bowed his head in deference. As you say, my king. But Astrid saw it. The flash of resentment, of barely contained fury, of ambition denied. She caught Ragnar's eye across the table, a silent warning passing between them. The seeds of betrayal had been planted long ago. They were beginning to bloom. The raid on the monastery of Lindisfarne should have been simple. 3 ships, 50 warriors, a target rich with gold and defenseless monks who would scatter like sheep before wolves. They had done it 100 times before. The ships cut through the gray waters like knives, oars rising and falling in perfect rhythm. The creak of wood, the splash of water, the low chanting of warriors preparing their minds for violence. It was a song Ragnar knew by heart. The salt spray stung his face, the wind whipped his hair, and somewhere above the clouds he could almost feel the Valkyries watching, waiting to see who would be chosen for their halls. Astrid stood beside him at the prow, shield and axe ready, her braided hair dark against the pale morning light. Halfdan's ship follows too close, she murmured, not looking at Ragnar. His men are tense, wrong kind of tense. Ragnar had noticed it too. The way his cousin's warriors kept their hands near their weapons even among allies. The way Halfdan himself kept glancing at Ragnar's back with an expression that went beyond mere respect. If he moves against me, will you stand with me? Ragnar asked quietly. Until the world burns, Astrid replied without hesitation. You know this. The monastery appeared through the mist like a ghost, its stone walls rising from the rocky shore, cross standing stark against the turbulent sky. They beached the ships with practiced efficiency, warriors pouring out onto the sand with weapons ready and blood singing hot in their veins. The raid began. Screams echoed off stone walls, the clash of steel against wood, against bone, against desperate flesh. Monks ran, prayed, died. Gold was gathered, relics smashed or stolen, the work of centuries destroyed in minutes of focused violence. This was what they were good at. This was what they had always been good at. Ragnar moved through the chaos with grim efficiency, Ulfhidnar cutting down any who stood in his way. But his mind was elsewhere, on the ships, on Halfdan, on the prickling awareness between his shoulder blades that whispered of danger. He was right to worry. It happened in the courtyard. Ragnar was checking a storage room, Bjorn and a handful of warriors with him, when he heard Astrid's warning shout cut through the din of battle. He turned just in time to see Halfdan and a dozen of his men blocking the courtyard exit, weapons drawn, expressions cold. "I'm sorry, cousin," Halfdan called out, though his voice held no sorrow, only the iron certainty of a man who had made his choice long ago. "But some men are born to rule, and some men are born to make way for those who are. You've had your time. Now I'll have mine." The betrayal hit harder than any blade. Not because Ragnar hadn't suspected, but because despite everything he'd learned, every lesson written in blood and betrayal, some small part of him had hoped that family meant something, that loyalty could exist without conditions. "You'll die for this," Ragnar said quietly, Ulfhidnar singing free of its scabbard with a sound like a wolf's howl. One of us will, Halfdan agreed, drawing his own blade. The battle that followed was vicious and intimate. No grand armies, no sweeping charges, just men trying to kill men in close quarters, the ring of steel on steel echoing off stone walls, grunts of effort mixing with screams of pain, blood painting the ancient stones in patterns the monks would scrub at for years. Bjorn fought like the berserker he was, his axes reaping a harvest of traitors. Ragnar moved through his cousin's men like death itself, Ulfhidnar finding throats, splitting skulls, writing his answer to betrayal in the language of violence. But Halfdan was skilled, had always been skilled. They met in the center of the carnage, blades clashing with sparks that died in the gray morning light. You could have been great, Halfdan snarled. Pressing an attack, could have built an empire that lasted, but you're too busy chasing your father's ghost. My father knew what you've forgotten, Ragnar growled, parrying and countering with brutal efficiency. That some things are worth more than survival, that how we die matters as much as how we live. Their blades locked, faces inches apart, and Ragnar saw it in his cousin's eyes, not just ambition, but fear. Fear that he was wrong. Fear that glory might actually matter. Fear that in trying to take everything, he had already lost what mattered most. Ragnar didn't give him time to process that revelation. Ulfhidnar found the gap in Halfdan's guard, sliding between ribs, finding the heart that had turned traitor long before the blade did. Halfdan's eyes went wide. He opened his mouth, perhaps to curse, perhaps to apologize, but all that came out was blood. I forgive you, Ragnar whispered as he lowered his dying cousin to the ground, but the gods will not. They burned Halfdan's body at sea, as was proper for a warrior, traitor though he was. The flames rose high against the darkening sky, smoke spiraling up toward clouds that gathered like spectators to a final act. Astrid stood beside Ragnar on the cliff overlooking the funeral ship, her hand finding his, squeezing once. Half your council dead or exiled, she said softly. Your cousin's betrayal known to all, some would say you're weakened. And what do you say? She smiled, fierce and proud. I say anyone who thinks you're weakened is welcome to test that theory. I'll enjoy adding their shields to your haul. Ragnar laughed, though the sound held no joy. Just exhaustion. Just the weight of years spent in battle, of trust betrayed, of the endless, grinding cost of being a king who refused to compromise. I'm tired, Astrid, he admitted, the confession coming easier than he expected. Tired of war. Tired of watching men I care about die for dreams that seem smaller every year. Then rest, she said simply. You've earned it. You've conquered more than any king in living memory. You've made the Christians pay for every inch of coast they hold. You've carved your name so deep into history that 1,000 years from now they'll still speak it. Will they remember me as I am, or as they want me to be? The fire consumed the ship, flames dancing like the spirits of the dead, and the wind carried the smoke toward the horizon where sea met sky met eternity. Does it matter? Astrid asked. We'll all be gone, just stories, just shadows. The only thing that matters is what we do with the time we have. And here is where the story takes its turn, the twist that changes everything. Because Ragnar Stormbreaker, the Viking king who challenged heaven and earth, who conquered kingdoms and broke armies, who made emperors tremble and gods take notice. Joe's peace. Not surrender, not defeat, but a conscious, deliberate choice to lay down Ulfhidnar and walk away from war. He divided his kingdom among his most loyal jarls, keeping only a small holding for himself on the coast where he'd been born. He released his warriors from their oaths, giving them gold and ships and the freedom to chase glory if they wished. He spent his remaining years not in battle, but in building schools for skalds, shipyards for merchants, halls where disputes were settled with words instead of blood. The other kings thought him weak, soft, finished. They were wrong. Ragnar had learned the greatest secret of all, *, that true strength lies not in the ability to conquer, but in the wisdom to know when conquest is not the answer. That the hardest battles are fought not with swords, but with the courage to choose a different path when everyone expects you to follow the old one. He lived another 20 winters in peace, watching his lands prosper, his people thrive, his legacy transform from one of war to one of wisdom. Astrid stayed by his side until the end, shield sister turned life partner, their love a quieter victory than any battle. When he died, it was in his sleep, in his own bed, with Ulfhidnar hanging above the fireplace and Astrid's hand in his. The funeral was attended by thousands. Not just Vikings, not just warriors, but people from every land he'd touched, every culture he'd fought against, every kingdom he'd once terrified. They came to pay respects not to a conqueror, but to a king who had proven that even the fiercest warrior could change, could choose creation over destruction, could leave a legacy that inspired rather than terrified. The image remains. The warrior king on the cliff, sword raised against the storm, frozen in a moment between past and future. But now you see it differently. Now you understand that the greatest battle isn't against enemies or elements or even gods. The greatest battle is against ourselves, against the voice that says we must be what we've always been, that our first choices define our last, that violence is the only language of power. Ragnar Stormbreaker challenged heaven and earth not by conquering them, but by refusing to be conquered by the expectations they placed upon him. His saga teaches us that legends aren't just built on battlefields. They're built in the quiet moments when we choose to be better than our worst impulses, when we turn from the easy path of destruction toward the harder path of creation, when we remember that the roar of the crowd fades, the glory dims, the gold tarnishes, but the lives we touch, the people we inspire, the change we create, those things echo into eternity. The sea remembers everything, they say. It remembers the blood he spilled and the lives he saved. It remembers the kingdoms he conquered and the peace he built. It remembers Ragnar Stormbreaker, not as a Viking king who challenged heaven and earth through violence, but as a man who challenged them by daring to evolve, to grow, to prove that even the fiercest heart can learn the wisdom of mercy. The storm breaks, the clouds part, the light falls across ancient waters. And somewhere in that light, if you listen closely, you can hear the skalds singing, not of battles won or enemies defeated, but of a king who conquered the hardest enemy of all himself, and in doing so, taught us all what it truly means to be legendary. This is the saga of Ragnar Stormbreaker. May we all have the courage to write our own. From the North Sea shores to the halls of memory, his legacy endures, not in the kingdoms he conquered, but in the question he left behind. What will you do with your one wild, precious, fleeting life? Will you spend it chasing the glory of others' expectations? Or will you have the courage to forge your own path, to challenge not just the world around you, but the world within? The choice, as always, is yours. The sea remembers, the wind remembers, and in the end, what matters most is what we give them to remember.